Welcome to lesson 3.6, order of operations with decimals. So you've learned at this point how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide numbers with decimals. And so now we're taking it the next step further. And if you have more than one operation in a question, how do you go about solving that? And you do that with what we call order of operations. So our focus for this lesson is to use that order of operations to evaluate different expressions and equations to solve expressions and equations that have decimals in them. Using the order of operations is important when we're solving equations that have multiple steps in it because it helps us find a common way that we would all solve an equation the same way. So for example, if I had, I'm just going to write down a random equation here, if I had, let's say 6 multiplied by 12.7 added to 11.9 divided by 12.1. There's many different ways we can go about solving this problem, and without some sort of order and structure, we'd all come up with a different answer. Like, for example, I might go 6 times 12.7 first, where somebody might first start with the adding and go 12.7 added to 11.9, in which case we'd get different answers if we took different steps. So the order of operations just gives everybody a common way and a common order that you need to solve equations with multiple steps in. And the way we typically think of that, and there's a little acronym for it, and I'm just going to write it down for us here, is, you may have heard of this before, is BEDMAS. And this is just the order in which you solve different operations when you have multiple steps in a question. So your B here stands for brackets. Oops, and I'm probably going to run out of the room. Your E stands for exponents, which we probably won't come across in any of these questions. D stands for division. M stands for multiplication. A stands for addition. And S stands for subtraction. So you follow the layout of BEDMAS. If I had an equation with brackets and division and multiplication and addition and subtraction, I would first solve the brackets. Then I would do the division and multiplication, and then I would do the adding and subtracting. So this is just a common order that everybody follows, so we all come up with the same answer. There is, however, a slight exception to the rule, and I'll make note of that and I'll mention it when we do our example together. But as you can see in the order of operations, you would solve for your brackets first, then your exponents, and then it says division and multiplication. So although it says division has to be solved before multiplication, that's not always true. In terms of if you have a question where you have division and multiplication in it, so if we look at this that I kind of wrote up really quickly at the beginning, I have 6 multiplied by 12.7, and then I also have 11.9 divided by 12.1. If I was just to follow this rule, I would have to do this division first, and then I would do the multiplication, which doesn't really make a difference. However, the exception to the rule with division and multiplication as well as adding and subtracting is you don't necessarily have to pay attention to the order, you just solve it from left to right. That being said, you have to do the division and multiplication first from left to right, and then you do adding and subtracting from left to right. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be in that order, and that's kind of the little exception to the rule. But again, I'll kind of make note of that when we do an example together. So here's one example that we're going to do together, and I'm sorry it's a little bit messy, but I think you can probably make out the numbers good enough for the purpose. Otherwise, I'm looking on page 108. And for most of these questions, I don't mind if you use a calculator to help you figure out the adding and subtracting. The point of this lesson is to practice the order of operations and understand and know which order you do to solve multi-step equations. So just to start off, I'm just going to write BEDMAS in the bottom corner here, just to remind me of my order of operations if I need a little help or I forget. So my first step is B, brackets. Do I see any brackets in this equation? And I should say yes, I see a bracket right here. So my first step is to solve for the brackets. So my first step is 4.75 added to 1.2. And if I was to add that up, I would get 5.95. So that was my first step. And then I'm just going to rewrite the rest of my equation just to make it easy for me. Plus 2.45 multiplied by 0.2, subtract 1.84. And this is just to keep my work organized and to make sure that I'm following all of the steps. So then I don't see any more brackets in my equation, so I can move on. I look at the e and exponents, and I don't have any exponents in this question, so I just keep moving on. And then we get to division and multiplication. So remember, we don't necessarily need to do it in that order. For division and multiplication, we just need to solve all of the division and multiplication operations from left to right. So I'm going to start looking from left, and I see that I have a division here and that I have a multiplication here. So my first step, because division falls first when I'm reading from left to right, is to solve this part of the equation. So I'm just going to use a different color. So this would be my next step, is 12.376 divided by 5.95. And when I solve that, I get 2.08. And then my second step, and I can kind of just kill two birds with one stone here, I see a multiplication equation right there, 2.45 times 0.2. And because I'm on the division and multiplication aspect, I'm just going to do that as well. So 2.45 multiplied by 0.2 comes out to 0.49. And so now that I've solved all the division and multiplication, I'm just going to rewrite out the rest of my equation. And now I'm on to the last section, which is addition and subtraction. And again, with addition and subtraction, you just read from left to right. You don't need to always do addition first. If subtraction comes first, let's say this was a minus sign and this was a plus sign, I would do the subtraction first, even though it comes later in my order of operations. Same rule applies, division, multiplication, as well as addition and subtraction. You just read from left to right. So I'm starting with left, and I see that my addition comes first and my subtraction comes next. So my first step is to solve this addition equation. I'm just going to use another color here. So 2.08 added to 0.49 is 2.57. And then my last step is to subtract 1.84. So that's my last step. So when I do that, my answer comes out to 0.73. So that's how you use the order of operations, or BEDMAS, to solve multi-step problems. So it's really important that you're just following those steps, because if you don't follow that order, then you will more than likely come up with a different answer if you were. So this is just the common way that we all use, so we're all on the same page and we're all solving multi-step questions the same.